They thought pain would teach him obedience, but they had never met a human who could choose what pain meant. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed was the sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a dry, precise click that echoed through the training chamber like a system registering a fault, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath as the gravity field hummed overhead at 1.5 G, pressing boots into the steel floor, tightening lungs, sharpening every heartbeat into something measurable, something undeniable. And Ethan stood there in the center of it all, his right arm hanging slightly off alignment, his breathing steady even as the pressure indicators flickered amber along the walls, warning every cadet that this was still only a controlled environment, still only a lesson, still only a test, except nothing about Instructor Vrax ever felt like only. The alien instructor stepped back with slow, deliberate calm, tall and rigid, his dark exoskeletal plates catching the cold white light in sharp angles, his presence filling the room more completely than the gravity itself, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same clinical weight, stripped of emotion, stripped of doubt, as if every word had been calculated long before Ethan ever walked into the academy. "Observe," Vrax said, his gaze sweeping across the class, not even sparing Ethan a second glance, as if the human had already been categorized, filed, understood. "This is what structural weakness looks like under pressure." No one moved. Not the four-armed cadets from Century Prime, not the tall silver-eyed twins from the outer rings, not even Lyra, who stood near the back with her luminous blue skin reflecting the overhead panels like quiet water, her eyes fixed on Ethan with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite curiosity, something unfinished, something waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when you decide something without needing to say it out loud, and then, with careful precision, he reached across his body, adjusted his sleeve, and began to stabilize his wrist using the flexible support strip embedded in his training suit, the fabric. Tightening with a soft mechanical hiss as it responded to his touch, forming a rigid brace, imperfect but functional, enough to hold alignment, enough to keep going. A few cadets shifted at that, subtle movements, small recalculations, because this wasn't in the pattern, this wasn't how it usually went, and Vrax noticed, of course he noticed, but he didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't interfere, he simply watched, head tilted just slightly, as if Ethan had just introduced a variable worth studying. "You may step aside," Vrax said after a moment, his tone unchanged, his authority absolute. Ethan shook his head once, barely perceptible, and reset his stance under the heavy pull of the chamber, boots grounded, shoulders squared, eyes forward. "Requesting continuation of training, sir," he said, voice calm, not loud, not defiant, just steady. That was when the silence changed. Not louder. Not sharper. Just different. Lyra felt it before she understood it, like a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm, and for the first time since the session began, her gaze moved from Ethan's injury to his face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. Vrax took one step closer, slow, deliberate, controlled, the kind of movement that turned attention into tension. "You believe continuation is possible," he said, not a question, not quite a statement. Ethan met his gaze, not challenging, not submissive, just present. "Yes, sir." Another pause. Longer this time. The gravity field pulsed softly overhead. Somewhere, a system clicked. And then Vrax gave a single nod. "Very well," he said. "Then we will continue." And for reasons none of them could explain yet, that simple decision felt heavier than the gravity pressing them all to the floor. The chamber did not change, but the way it felt did, as if the air itself had taken note of Ethan Cole and adjusted its expectations, the low hum of the gravity field steady at 1.5 G, pressing down with quiet insistence while the overhead lights cast long, sterile reflections across the reinforced floor, and somewhere along the far wall a digital timer resumed its silent countdown, marking the continuation of a lesson that had already gone off script. Ethan rolled his shoulders once, testing balance, letting his body map the new limits, the brace around his wrist holding firm with a faint mechanical tension that pulsed in sync with his heartbeat, not perfect, not comfortable, but enough, always enough, and when he stepped back into formation his movements were deliberate, measured, as if each inch of motion had to be earned rather than assumed. Around him, the other cadets recalibrated in their own ways, subtle shifts of posture, adjustments in stance, the kind of small corrections that revealed more than any spoken reaction ever could, because this was not how the pattern usually unfolded, not how the instructors demonstrated weakness, not how a subject responded after being categorized as fragile. Lyra watched from her position, arms loosely at her sides, her luminous blue skin catching the cool light in soft gradients, her eyes following Ethan not with pity but with a growing, quiet calculation, the kind that questioned underlying assumptions rather than surface outcomes. "Pair rotations," Vrax announced, his voice cutting cleanly through the chamber without raising in volume, and the floor indicators flickered to life, projecting training zones in pale amber grids, each one marking a controlled engagement area, each one a test within the larger test. Ethan stepped into his assigned zone, opposite a cadet nearly a foot taller, broad-shouldered, with segmented armor plating that flexed as it moved, a species known for precision and speed, and for a brief moment they simply faced each other, both aware of the imbalance, both aware that the parameters had shifted before the exercise even began. The signal tone sounded, a short, neutral chime, and movement followed, not explosive, not reckless, but exact, each step calculated against the added weight of the gravity field, each motion controlled to maintain balance, to conserve energy, to avoid unnecessary strain, and Ethan adapted in real time, favoring his left side, adjusting his center of mass, letting the brace take only what it could handle while the rest of his body compensated without hesitation. Across the room, Vrax observed, his posture unchanged, his attention precise, noting not just the execution but the intention behind it, the absence of panic, the absence of visible frustration, the presence of something else entirely, something that did not fit neatly into the frameworks he had used for every other species that passed through his instruction. Lyra noticed it too, though she could not yet name it, the way Ethan moved not as if he were trying to prove something to the class, or even to the instructor, but as if he were answering a question that only he could hear, something internal, something quiet, something stubbornly consistent. The exchange ended without spectacle, without collapse, without the expected failure that would have confirmed the lesson, and as the cadets reset positions, the silence that followed carried a different weight than before, less about control, more about uncertainty. Vrax stepped forward again, his shadow cutting across the light, and for the first time since the session began, his focus settled directly on Ethan, not as a demonstration, not as a warning, but as a variable that refused to resolve. "Human," he said, voice steady, analytical, "you adapt beyond projected tolerance." Ethan met his gaze, breathing even, posture grounded. "Yes, sir." A brief pause, just long enough to register. Then Vrax gave a single, measured nod. "Continue." And somewhere beneath the controlled environment, beneath the measured data and the structured drills, something fundamental had shifted, not in strength, not in rank, but in the quiet space where expectation met reality and failed to explain it. The next phase began without announcement, as if the system itself had decided there was no need for explanation anymore, and the chamber lighting dimmed by a fraction, barely noticeable except in the way shadows deepened along the edges of the floor grids, turning every movement into something more defined, more exposed, while the gravity field adjusted again, a subtle increase that pressed against muscle and bone with quiet insistence. Not enough to break, but enough to remind every cadet. That endurance was never static, it was something that could be taken away at any moment. Ethan Cole felt it immediately, the shift registering not just in his legs but in the way his balance recalibrated, the brace around his wrist tightening slightly as the suit compensated for the additional strain, and for a brief second his body hesitated, not from pain, not from fear, but from calculation, measuring what remained, what could still be used, what had to be conserved. Around him, the others adjusted faster, their physiology built for environments like this, their movements efficient, practiced, expected, and yet there was a difference now, a fraction of attention that kept returning to him, to the human who had not stepped aside when he was given the chance, who had not reacted the way the system predicted. "Endurance cycle," Vrax stated, his voice carrying through the chamber with the same measured authority, and the floor grid shifted again, expanding into wider zones, longer paths, forcing movement rather than engagement, forcing time rather than outcome, and that was where weakness usually revealed itself, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of strain. Ethan moved when the signal tone sounded, steady pace, controlled breathing, each step placed with intention as the artificial gravity pulled against him, making every motion cost more than it should, and he did not try to match the others, did not chase their speed, did not compete for position. He simply continued, one step after another, conserving energy, managing balance, letting the rhythm settle into something sustainable. Lyra followed a parallel path across the chamber, her stride smooth, almost effortless despite the increased load, her species built for variable environments, but her focus drifted, again and again, toward Ethan, watching the way he adjusted without hesitation, the way he accepted limitation without surrendering to it, and something about that unsettled her more than any display of strength could have. Minutes stretched, measured by the silent timer along the wall, and fatigue began to show across the class, subtle at first, a slight delay in reaction, a heavier step, a longer exhale, and yet Ethan remained consistent. Not fast, not dominant, just present, still moving, still choosing to continue, and that consistency drew attention in a way that raw ability never did. Vrax observed from the center of the chamber, his posture unchanged, his gaze tracking patterns rather than individuals, but even within that analytical focus, Ethan stood out, not because he exceeded expectations, but because he refused to collapse into them. At the midpoint of the cycle, the system introduced variation, the floor panels shifting elevation by a few inches, altering footing, forcing recalibration mid-stride, and several cadets faltered, quickly recovering, but the disruption was enough to break rhythm, enough to expose reliance on predictability. Ethan adjusted slower, but cleaner, his movements deliberate, each step confirmed before the next began, and when his balance wavered for a fraction of a second, he did not fight it, did not force correction, he let it pass, then continued, as if the moment had never existed. Lyra noticed that more than anything else, the absence of resistance where resistance was expected, the choice to adapt instead of oppose, and for the first time, a question formed clearly in her mind, not about his strength, but about his intention. The cycle ended with a low tone, the gravity field stabilizing, the floor returning to level, and the chamber settled into silence once more, but it was no longer the silence of control, it was the silence of observation, of something being reconsidered in real time. Vrax stepped forward, his presence cutting through the stillness, and his eye settled on Ethan again, not as a demonstration, not as a warning, but as a subject that no longer aligned with the model. "You do not optimize for dominance," he said, voice even, precise. Ethan exhaled once, steady, grounded. "No, sir." Another pause, longer this time, as if the answer itself required processing. "Then what do you optimize for?" Vrax asked. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "To keep going." And for a brief moment, the system had no immediate response to that. The chamber light stabilized at a colder spectrum, shifting from neutral white to a pale, almost clinical blue that flattened shadows and stripped depth from every surface, turning the entire space into something sharper, less forgiving, while the gravity field eased back down to baseline as if offering relief, though everyone in the room understood it was not a reward, only a reset before something more deliberate. Ethan Cole stood where the cycle had ended, chest rising in slow, controlled breaths, the brace on his wrist still holding, still doing its quiet work, and for the first time since the session began, the absence of pressure felt heavier than the weight itself, because it meant the next phase would not test endurance, it would test choice. Around him, the cadets reformed into a wide semicircle, their positions no longer dictated by the floor grids but by Vrax's silent expectation, each one facing inward, each one becoming part of an audience rather than a participant, and that alone shifted the atmosphere from training to evaluation. Lyra moved with the others, taking her place near the front without fully realizing it, her attention fixed on Ethan in a way that felt less like observation and more like anticipation, as if something unspoken was about to be revealed and she did not want to miss the moment it happened. Vrax stepped forward into the center of the chamber, his presence anchoring the space with that same measured stillness, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different cadence, not louder, not harsher, but more focused, as if the variables had narrowed. "Demonstration," he said, and the word settled across the room with quiet finality. His gaze moved briefly across the class before returning to Ethan, not lingering, not emphasizing, simply selecting. "You will engage." There was no elaboration, no explanation of parameters, and that absence was its own instruction, because uncertainty was part of the design, part of the pressure, part of the test that went beyond physical capability. Ethan stepped forward without hesitation, not fast, not dramatic, just present, moving into the open space with the same deliberate control he had shown from the beginning, and for a moment nothing happened, the chamber holding its breath again, waiting for the signal that would define the engagement. It never came. Instead, Vrax moved, not with sudden force, not with aggression, but with precise intent, closing the distance in a single smooth motion that demanded response rather than reaction, and Ethan responded, adjusting his stance, shifting his balance, meeting the movement without escalating it, his injured arm held close, protected but not hidden. The exchange that followed was not loud, not chaotic, it was controlled, measured, each motion answered by another, each adjustment met with a counterbalance, and what stood out was not speed or strength but restraint, the absence of excess, the refusal to push beyond what was necessary. Around the circle, the cadets watched in silence, their attention sharpened by the lack of spectacle, because this was not what they were trained to expect, not what they had been taught to recognize as dominance or victory. Lyra felt it most clearly, the tension not in what was happening, but in what was not, the missing escalation, the missing moment where one side would force the outcome, and she realized, slowly, that Ethan was not trying to win in the way the system defined winning, he was trying to maintain something else entirely. Vrax paused the exchange with a subtle shift of posture, stepping back just enough to create space, his eyes fixed on Ethan with that same analytical intensity, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching between them like an unanswered question. "You had opportunity," Vrax said, voice even, precise. Ethan's breathing steadied, his stance unchanged. "Yes, sir." Another pause, longer this time, the kind that forced attention rather than commanded it. "You did not act to conclude," Vrax continued. Ethan met his gaze, calm, grounded. "No, sir." The chamber remained still, every cadet listening, every expectation waiting for resolution, and when Vrax spoke again, there was something almost imperceptible beneath the words, not doubt, not approval, but recognition of something that did not fit the framework he had relied on. "Explain," he said. Ethan did not look at the others, did not search for the right answer, he simply spoke. Because ending it was not the objective. And in the quiet that followed, the lesson began to change shape. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the space between them like something alive, something listening, and for the first time since the session began, the attention of the room shifted away from movement and toward meaning, toward the gap between what was expected and what had just been said, because in this chamber, objectives were always defined, always enforced, and yet Ethan Cole had just stepped outside of that structure without raising his voice, without resisting authority, simply by choosing a different interpretation. Vrax did not respond immediately, his posture remaining perfectly aligned, his presence unchanged, but there was a pause now that did not belong to the lesson plan, a pause that existed because something had not resolved, and the system, for all its precision, had no immediate correction for it. Around the semicircle, the cadets remained still, but their focus sharpened, subtle shifts of attention revealing that the moment mattered more than any physical exchange that had come before, because this was no longer about technique, it was about framework, about the rules that defined every action they had been trained to take. Lyra felt it with a clarity that unsettled her, the way Ethan's answer lingered in her thoughts, not as defiance, not as ignorance, but as something dangerously simple, something that suggested the objective itself could be questioned, and that possibility had never been part of her training. "The objective is assigned," Vrax said at last, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a sharper edge of focus, as if the variables had narrowed even further. "Deviation introduces inefficiency." Ethan did not move, did not shift his stance, his breathing still even, his gaze steady. "Yes, sir," he replied, not arguing, not contradicting, simply acknowledging the structure as it existed. Another pause followed, shorter this time, but heavier, because the acknowledgement did not resolve the conflict, it only clarified it. Vrax stepped closer, not invading, not forcing, but closing the distance enough to reassert presence, to bring the exchange back into measurable parameters. "Then define your objective," he said, the words precise, deliberate, a direct challenge framed as inquiry. Ethan exhaled once, slow, controlled, and for a brief moment his eyes shifted, not to the other cadets, not to the instructor, but inward, as if confirming something that had already been decided long before he stepped into this chamber. "To complete the training," he said. The answer was simple, almost expected, and yet it did not settle the tension because it did not align with the behavior that had just been observed. Vrax's gaze remained fixed, unblinking, analytical. "Completion requires conclusion," he stated. "You did not conclude." Ethan nodded once, a small, grounded motion. "I did not end the engagement," he said, choosing his words with the same precision he applied to his movement. "But I stayed within it." The distinction hung in the air, subtle but undeniable, and for a moment no one spoke, because the implication was there, clear enough to be understood, difficult enough to be accepted. Lyra felt it fully now, the shift from observation to realization, the recognition that Ethan was not rejecting the system, he was operating within it in a way that the system had not accounted for, preserving continuity instead of forcing resolution, choosing to remain rather than to dominate. Vrax straightened slightly, the smallest adjustment in posture, but enough to signal that the evaluation had reached a new threshold. "Continuation without resolution," he said, almost to himself, as if testing the concept against established models. The chamber remained silent, every cadet aware that something fundamental was being examined, not just in Ethan, but in the framework that defined them all. After a moment, Vrax stepped back, restoring the distance, restoring the structure, but not the certainty. "The exercise is not yet complete," he said, his voice returning to its standard cadence, though the weight behind it had changed. "We will proceed." Ethan inclined his head once, acknowledging the instruction, and returned to his position without hesitation, without relief, simply continuing, as he always had. And as the chamber prepared for the next phase, one thing had become clear in a way that no physical demonstration could have achieved: the human was not resisting the system, he was revealing its limits, and no one in the room could ignore that anymore. The system did not announce the next phase, but the chamber responded anyway, the overhead panels dimming another degree as a low resonance built beneath the floor, subtle at first, then steady, like distant thunder contained within metal and code, and the gravity field recalibrated once more, not increasing, not decreasing, but shifting distribution, creating uneven pressure zones that forced constant adjustment, removing the last trace of predictability from the environment. Ethan Cole felt it immediately, not as weight, but as imbalance, the kind that required continuous correction rather than singular effort, and he adjusted his stance without thinking, feet repositioning, shoulders aligning, breath slowing to match the new rhythm, while the brace around his wrist held firm, a quiet anchor in a system designed to destabilize everything else. Around the chamber, the cadets reacted with precision, their movements efficient, their training evident, but there was a tension now that had not been present before, a subtle awareness that the evaluation was no longer confined to physical performance, that something less measurable was being observed. "Variable field," Vrax stated, his voice cutting through the low resonance with clean authority, and the floor indicators flickered briefly before disappearing entirely, removing even the visual guidance that had structured previous phases, leaving only instinct, adaptation, and decision. Ethan moved first, not because he was faster, but because he chose to engage the uncertainty rather than wait for it to resolve, stepping forward into the uneven pull of the chamber, letting his body find balance through motion rather than resistance, each step small, controlled, intentional. Lyra watched from across the space, her own movement smooth, calculated, but her focus split now, divided between maintaining her own stability and observing. Ethan's approach, the way he did not fight the shifting field, did not attempt to dominate it, but instead aligned with it, adjusting continuously, as if he accepted the instability as part of the process rather than an obstacle to overcome. The resonance deepened, a low hum that vibrated through bone and suit alike, and several cadets faltered for a fraction of a second, their footing disrupted, their rhythm broken, quickly recovered but not unnoticed, because in this phase, even the smallest deviation carried weight. Ethan felt the shift as well, a sudden lateral pull that threatened to unbalance him, and for a moment his body leaned into it, following the motion instead of correcting against it, allowing the force to pass through him before recentering, a choice that looked almost like surrender until it resolved into stability. Vrax observed from the center, his gaze tracking not just the outcomes but the decisions that led to them, the micro-adjustments, the timing, the intent, and Ethan's pattern did not align with any of the established models, because he was not minimizing movement, not maximizing control, he was maintaining continuity, preserving flow where others sought dominance over the environment. The field shifted again, sharper this time, a sudden redistribution that forced immediate recalibration, and Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, not frozen, not uncertain, but assessing, then stepped forward again, choosing direction without waiting for equilibrium, and that choice carried him through the instability rather than leaving him reacting to it. Lyra felt something settle in her understanding, not fully formed, but undeniable, the realization that Ethan was not trying to solve the environment. He was moving with it, staying within it, refusing to be separated from the process by the need to control it. The resonance began to fade, the field stabilizing gradually, and as the pressure evened out across the chamber, the cadet slowed, returning to neutral stance, the phase concluding without signal, without declaration, as if the system itself had nothing more to add. Vrax stepped forward once more, his presence recentering the space, and his eye settled on Ethan again, not with the detached analysis of earlier phases, but with a focus that suggested something had been identified, though not yet defined. "You do not resist disruption," he said, voice even, precise. Ethan's breathing remained steady, his posture grounded. "No, sir." A brief pause followed, the kind that marked a transition rather than a conclusion. "You integrate it," Vrax continued. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the observation without claiming it. "Yes, sir." The chamber remained silent, every cadet aware that the lesson had moved beyond technique, beyond endurance, into something less tangible, something that could not be measured by strength alone. Vrax held Ethan's gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back, restoring distance, restoring structure, but not the certainty that had once defined it. "Proceed to final evaluation," he said, and for the first time since the session began, the words carried not just instruction, but anticipation. The chamber did not reset this time, it held its state as if the system itself understood that nothing needed to be adjusted further, the light steady, the air still, the gravity field neutral but heavy with expectation, and for a long moment no one moved, because the words final evaluation did not signal an action, they signaled a decision. Ethan Cole stood where he had finished the last phase, his breathing slow, his posture grounded, the brace on his wrist still firm against his skin, a quiet reminder of where the test had begun, and for the first time since entering the chamber, there was no immediate instruction to follow, no defined sequence to execute, only the presence of Instructor Vrax at the center of the space, watching. The other cadets shifted slightly, forming a wider circle without being told, instinct guiding them into positions where they could observe without interfering, their attention fixed not on the environment, but on Ethan, because by now it was clear that whatever came next would not apply equally to all of them. Lyra stood near the front again, her luminous blue skin reflecting the steady overhead light, her eyes focused with a clarity that had replaced earlier uncertainty, because she had begun to understand that this was no longer about performance, it was about definition, about what the human represented within a system that had never accounted for him. Vrax took one step forward, the motion slow, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that was different from every previous instruction, not louder, not harsher, but more precise, as if every word had been narrowed to its essential function. "Final evaluation requires resolution," he said, and the statement settled into the chamber with quiet authority, not as a command, but as a boundary. Ethan met his gaze, steady, present, and waited, because he understood now that reacting too soon would mean returning to a pattern he had already moved beyond. The pause stretched, not empty, but full of attention, every cadet aware that the next moment would define the outcome in a way that no previous phase had. Then Vrax moved again, closing the distance just enough to create tension, not initiating an exchange, but establishing proximity, forcing the decision into the present rather than leaving it abstract. "Conclude," he said, a single word, precise, unavoidable. Ethan did not move immediately, and that hesitation was not weakness, it was choice, a deliberate moment where action was considered rather than triggered, and in that space, something shifted again, not in the chamber, but in the understanding of everyone watching. Lyra felt it as a quiet realization, the recognition that this was the point where every other cadet would act according to training, where the system expected a final demonstration, a clear outcome, a defined end, and yet Ethan remained still for one more second, holding the moment without breaking it. When he did move, it was not to escalate, not to force conclusion, but to step back, just a single step, creating space where none had been offered, and the motion was small, almost unremarkable, except for what it meant. The chamber seemed to react to that choice, not physically, but perceptually, as if the absence of expected action had created a gap in the system's logic, a space where the outcome could no longer be predicted. Vrax did not follow, did not close the distance again. He simply watched, his gaze fixed, analytical, and for the first time since the session began, there was something beneath that analysis, something that did not resolve into data. "You refuse conclusion," he said, not accusing, not approving, simply stating what he observed. Ethan's voice was calm, steady, grounded. "No, sir," he replied. Another pause, longer now, the kind that forced reconsideration rather than response. "I am completing it," Ethan continued. The distinction hung in the air, subtle but absolute, and in that moment, the final evaluation stopped being about what Ethan would do, and became about what the system could understand, and no one in the chamber could ignore that shift anymore. The chamber did not move, but something inside it did, a shift too subtle for sensors, too precise for metrics, and yet every cadet felt it, the moment where expectation failed to predict outcome and had nowhere left to go, and in that space, silence became heavier than any gravity field the system had deployed before. Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had stepped back, not retreating, not disengaging, simply holding position with the same quiet control he had carried through every phase, his breathing even, his posture grounded, the brace around his wrist still firm, still present, a reminder not of limitation, but of continuity, because he had never stepped outside the test, he had only refused to end it the way it demanded. Vrax remained where he stood, unmoving, his presence still anchoring the chamber, but no longer defining it completely, because for the first time, the structure around him did not fully respond to his expectation, and that absence of immediate resolution carried its own weight. Around them, the cadets did not shift, did not speak, their attention locked into the moment with a focus that had evolved from observation into realization, because what they were witnessing was no longer a demonstration of skill, it was a redefinition of purpose. Lyra felt it most clearly, the final piece settling into place in her understanding, the recognition that Ethan had not refused the instructor, had not resisted the system, he had accepted both completely, and then chosen to operate within them on his own terms, and that difference, that quiet, deliberate difference, was something her training had never prepared her to process. Vrax's gaze remained fixed on Ethan, analytical, precise, but now layered with something that did not resolve into calculation alone, and when he spoke, his voice carried a fraction of delay, a moment of consideration that had not existed before. "Completion requires measurable endpoint," he said, the statement as controlled as ever, but no longer absolute. Ethan did not step forward, did not close the distance, he simply answered from where he stood, his voice steady, clear, unforced. "Yes, sir." Another pause followed, not empty, but full, as if the system itself was waiting for alignment that would not come. "Define your endpoint," Vrax continued, the words precise, but now carrying an edge of inquiry rather than instruction. Ethan's eyes did not shift, his focus remained steady, and when he spoke, it was with the same simplicity that had carried him through every phase. "I am still here," he said. The words were not dramatic, not complex, but they settled into the chamber with a weight that none of the cadets could ignore, because in a system built on outcomes, on conclusions, on dominance and resolution, the idea that presence itself could be the endpoint was not just unfamiliar, it was incompatible. Lyra felt her breath slow as the realization expanded, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet certainty, the understanding that Ethan's objective had never been to win, never been to conclude, but to remain, to endure, to continue without breaking the structure or himself, and that choice, that consistent, deliberate choice, had carried him further than any predefined outcome could have. Vrax held his gaze for a long moment, the chamber silent around them, every cadet aware that this was the point where the system would either reassert itself or change, and when Vrax finally moved, it was not forward, not to close the distance, but a single step back, small, controlled, but unmistakable. The shift was subtle, but absolute, a recognition not of defeat, not of surrender, but of something that could not be forced into resolution without losing its meaning. "You maintain continuity beyond termination parameters," Vrax said, his voice steady, but no longer purely declarative. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the observation without claiming it. "Yes, sir." Another pause, then Vrax turned, not away, but aside, breaking the direct line of engagement, and in doing so, he ended the evaluation without the conclusion the system had been built to demand. The chamber remained still, the cadets unmoving, and in that quiet, the lesson completed itself, not through action, not through force, but through the absence of both, and for the first time, the system had nothing left to correct. No signal marked the end, no tone, no command, only the absence of further instruction, and in that absence the chamber felt larger than before, not in size, but in meaning, as if the space itself had expanded to hold something the system had not been designed to contain. Ethan Cole remained where he stood, not out of hesitation, not out of uncertainty, but because nothing in the moment required movement, his breathing steady, his posture unchanged, the brace on his wrist still firm, still quiet, a constant that had followed him from the beginning to the end without ever defining him. Around the perimeter, the cadets did not immediately relax, did not break formation, because they were waiting, not for instruction, but for confirmation, something to tell them how to interpret what had just happened, and when none came, their stillness shifted into something else, something closer to awareness. Lyra was the first to move, though even that movement was subtle, a single step forward that closed the distance by only a few inches, her luminous blue skin catching the steady light, her eyes fixed on Ethan not with curiosity now, but with recognition, because she understood what the others were still processing, that the human had not overcome the system, had not defeated it, he had simply revealed a boundary it could not cross. Vrax stood at the center, his posture as precise as ever, but the stillness around him was different now, no longer anchored solely by his authority, because the outcome of the evaluation had not followed the expected path, and yet it had not failed, it had completed itself in a way that could not be measured by standard parameters. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the chamber with the same clarity as before, but without the rigid certainty that had defined it. "Evaluation complete," he said, and the word settled into the space without finality, more acknowledgement than conclusion. A few cadets shifted at that, the tension easing slightly, but the silence did not break because the statement answered only part of the question. Vrax turned his gaze back to Ethan, holding it for a moment that stretched just long enough to matter, and when he spoke again, the precision remained, but the meaning had changed. "Human," he said, not as a label, not as a category, but as a designation that now carried weight beyond classification. Ethan met his gaze, steady, grounded, present. "Yes, sir." Another pause, and in that pause something settled, not into the system, but into understanding. "Your method does not align with established doctrine," Vrax continued, the statement as direct as ever, but no longer dismissive. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging without defending. "No, sir." The chamber remained still, every cadet listening, because this was the moment where judgment would be defined, where the system would either reject the deviation or adapt to it. Vrax did neither. Instead, he spoke with a precision that had always been present, but now carried something new beneath it. "It will be recorded," he said. That was all. No correction. No penalty. No endorsement. Just recognition. Lyra exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she was holding, because she understood what the others would come to understand in time, that in a system built to measure strength, the human had introduced something else entirely, something that could not be quantified, only observed. Ethan remained where he stood for a moment longer, then stepped back into line, not as a gesture of submission, not as a retreat, but as a continuation, because for him, the test had never been about the moment, it had always been about staying within it. The chamber lights held steady, the gravity field neutral, the environment unchanged, and yet everything was different, because the rules had not been broken, they had been expanded. No one spoke as the cadets slowly began to disperse, their movements quieter, more deliberate, each one carrying a fragment of the realization with them. Lyra lingered for a second longer, her gaze meeting Ethan's just once, and in that brief exchange there was no need for words, only understanding. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not force the outcome. He simply remained. And somehow, that had been enough.